Hello and welcome back to part 2 of the texture painting tutorial. Well, we actually talked about how to set up the texture painting, and now we will get into detail with the tools, or the texture painting tools. Now first off, there's one thing I wanted to mention. Right now we have this faceted kind of surface. We can change it by going up here to Tools and go to Shade Smooth, or the Shade Smooth option. Click on it and we will get the smooth surface. If we want to revert this change, we can just go up here again on the shading and then go to flat shading. But we will use a smooth shading. Okay. So first off, right now we should still have the texture here. However, when we go to UV and set it to texture, we don't have anything inside the image editor, or rather in the UV editor. So in order to fix this, we go up here to this little image icon and click on Interesting UV. That way we have it back here. Okay, before we start going to the tutorials or to the tools, I wanted to mention one important thing. You are not just able to paint on the 3D surface here, you can also paint directly on the 2D coordinate. Or inside the UV editor. You can do that by going up here to this view option and then click on paint. This will enable you to paint directly on your UV map. I will go back to the view and now I will go into the texture painting mode. In order to be able to texture paint on top of the 3D object, we need to go down here on the object mode, click on it and then go to texture paint. This will open up our left panel here with our brush options. Okay, so the first option we have here is called the F texture draw, or the texture draw option. This is basically in comparison the same like in an image editing program. So this option is actually a completely normal brush you would use in an image editing program. You can just select the foreground color, which I will set to red, and the background color, which is black. So when I paint on it, it will appear like I would use a normal brush. Okay. The next option we have here is the radius. So this controls how big the brush is, or how the brush size is. The next one here under it is the opacity. That means 0 means transparent and 1 means fully opaque. So if I would go to 0.5, it would be semi-transparent. So this is 0.5, this is fully opaque, and this is transparent. We have also these two things here. This one here, you can flip the colors. So the background color is the foreground color and the foreground color is the background color. So it just switches them. Then we have the pipette tool where we can just sample a color. Okay. One thing I wanted to mention is when you use the pipette tool here, or the sample color tool, it's not automatically applied as a foreground color. So you need to click on it first. And you have it actually saved up here. You can also create new colors by, let's say, clicking here and then setting the foreground color to green, and then just click the plus icon. That way you get color palettes here. Okay. So the next thing down here is called blend, and these are called blend modes or blending modes. These are also available in image editing programs like Photoshop and Krita and GIMP and so on. And we have a lot of different blending modes here. The most important we will use is the overlay, the mix, and the color dodge blending modes. The mix we already have selected is basically drawing on something. It applies the color as it is. Now when you, for example, go to overlay, it will take the underlying color and give it more contrast. So we will basically stack it, or rather blend it into our underlying color. So when I color it here, it will get a yellow kind of tone. That's because I overlay green on red. So you can create really nice neon effects and overlay effects like skin tones, give something more contrast and so on. So it blends nicely with the underlying color. Then we have the color dodge. And the color dodge is actually an interesting thing. First off, to use color dodge, you need a lighter color or a light color. You can't just get down to black or to these kind of values. You at least need to be on a light gray or something in between this and this range. So I will just select it to use white. And when I then put it on, you will see that it will kind of create a specular color here. Or it will use the underlying color and just brighten it up. That's what color dodge does. So you could, for example, create anime eyes and such. But it's cool for different kinds of effects. The next thing here or down here is the accumulate stroke dots on top of each other. This means we can stack colors, or rather stack the brush. The longer we move the mouse and hold the left mouse button down. So for example, when I select it, hold the left mouse button down and then drag around with the mouse, you will see that it gets progressively stronger the longer I actually move my mouse. So that's what accumulate strokes means. It's basically brush strokes stacked on top of each other. Then we have the log alpha enabled. That means we have actually an image which has the texture information RGB, and we have the channel called alpha. The alpha is mostly used for transparency, for roughness maps. You can actually utilize the alpha channel for various things. However, mostly you don't want to paint on the alpha because you want to keep transparency information or anything like that. This option will prevent you for painting on alpha channels. So you can just paint on the RGB channels but not on the alpha channel. Then the last one is called use gradient. I will not get into it, but you can create gradients between two colors here. But I'm just not using it. The next tab we have here is called texture. Now inside the texture slot we can add new textures, basically new brushes we can use. So it's like an image editing program. You just change a brush and then you use it. I will just create a new one by clicking on under this checkerboard texture, and here I can actually rename it to a different texture for texture name. For example, let's say tech. Now I need to specify this image or this brush. So I need to go onto the right panel here, go to the sphere checkerboard, which is next to the triangle, the sphere checkerboard here, and click on it. Then, oops, that's the wrong one. We need to go to the checkerboard here, this icon, not this icon, but this square checkerboard icon. Then we need to go to the image texture because we don't want to change our UV map. and we change it to brush tag because we named it tag. Now the last thing you need to do is go down to image, then click on open, and then go to the folder where you have different brushes. So we will use, let's say, tag art 1 and open image. Now you see a preview here, and when you then use it, you will see, oh, we have a nice pattern here. So basically we can use a new brush and import new brushes. One thing I need to mention is Blender or Bforartists might forget your samples or your textures. I don't know how to permanently save them, but if Blender loses it, you need to reload the brushes and basically do these steps again. But well, I don't know the solution of it, but it's certainly out there on the internet. So as you can see, when I paint it, you see it's always on the same texture coordinate. So it's always the same screen space it's being mapped on. That's because we have the brush mapping enabled, and which tells us that it's untiled. So our brush mapping is tiled, which means it tiles our brush. But we can change it. We can change it to stencil. I will not go into detail with stencil, but it's just it's like you have a brush stuck on your viewport, and you are basically overlaying it in your viewport and creating stamps on top of the 3D mesh. However, I'm not using it, so I will just go to the next one. The next one is called random. And with random, you can create random shapes with the tiles texture. So it's being applied in random locations all the time. You can also change the angle here, which means we can rotate a mesh, or we can rotate the brush. So this angle option here enables us to change the brush or the brush rotation. So we are on, when we are on 90 degrees, we can, or we rotated our brush to 90 degrees and such. Then we have something called Rake. Very important, very interesting, especially for hairs, tattoos, and organic painting actually. It works like a rake, like it says here. So when you paint across it and down here, you will see it follows the vector direction of the mouse. So when I go to the left mouse, or when I go to the left side of my viewport and then suddenly turn to the right side, you see that it follows a curve. So this is a pretty cool tool to create organic shapes and ornaments and so on. Then we have random, which can randomize rotations from 0 to 360. And we can have offset, which offsets our brush, so it has a different position where it starts. For example, when I put 5, 5, 5, it would mean we have a little bit of offset here with the brush. Then we have the size option here, or the size parameter. And this size parameter applies to the brush directly. So, for example, if I would put the size to 0.5, for example, it would mean that we only cut the brush in half and just paint with the last half of it. So like you can see, I just have half of the brush anymore. The same applies when we make it bigger, for example. It would basically tile our brush, or our source brush. so it gets smaller and more detailed. Okay, let's set it back again. Then we have more brush mappings. So all these things like angle, like rake, random, offset and size can all be applied to the brush mapping. So stencil has it, random has it, 3D, tiles, viewplane has it. They are all options for the brush mappings. So the next thing is 3D. And the 3D brush mapping, for example, uses or applies the brush on a 3D scale. So like you can see, it scales it in a 3D space. Then we have the tiled, which I already explained, it tiles. And then we have the view plane. It's a very useful tool. Because when we use the view plane, I will just delete my brush right now. When we use the view plane, we can actually paint in the rotation our camera is in. So when our viewport actually points towards this point, it will take our point into consideration. But when we, for example, change the view to this, for example, we will get a slanted kind of experience. So our strokes will be slanted and will look a little bit stretched. So this takes our viewpoint into consideration where we paint. So these are the brush mappings. So the next thing is texture mask. I will not go into detail with it because texture mask is just used to mask out certain areas where you don't want to paint on, but based on an image or a brush. Then we have stroke. This is very important because we have different stroking methods. The first one we are applying is the space stroke method. The stroke method decides how our brush is being applied. So when I, for example, use space, I can just drag around and it will space my brush according to the spacing I have set here. So when I would change it to 1, I would get much denser brush strokes increments. So we will get this smooth kind of airbrushy effect. When I would increase the spacing, it would space out the brushes evenly. So that's what the space brush does on this and the spacing option. Now we have something called jitter. Jitter means we can use it as a scattering tool. So if we don't want to have brushes or just one brush, we can actually use it as a scatter brush. So it scatters around the surface. This is what this option is here for. Now I can also use something called smooth stroke. That's very important for mouse users who don't have any tablet or anything like that. When you enable it, you have a radius. Whoops. You have a radius here, which you can change. And this radius means we can drag the brush behind us. So we can drag the brush here and it will follow just a little bit behind our movements. That way our movement is being smoothed out. So you can create nice curves and such. A very useful tool. With the radius you can decide how far it should be or how far-fetched it should be. It's basically the stepping increments. And a lower radius means it's more direct. A more direct smoothing experience. We have the factor, which means how strong it is. So higher values means higher smoothing, but also higher dragging radius. Okay. So then we have different stroking methods. I will disable smooth stroke and go to the next stroke method called dots. Dots can be very useful to create some kind of a lava lamp kind of experience. Because when we put the jittering up and the scattering, it will clump together. So it's like a lot of different little brushes which clump together to one big brush. So it's very useful to create like lava kind of or magma kind of things or water and such. So this is a pretty nice tool. Then we have the drag dot, which means as long as we hold down our left mouse button and don't let go, it will not be placed. So when I let go of my left mouse button, it will be applied. So that's very important. So it's kind of a nice tool to position things. Okay, so we have, or the next option we have is called Airbrush, which is self-explanatory. It's acting like an airbrush. Higher rates means it's kind of not applied, and low values means it's heavily applied. So the next thing we have here is called Anchored. I use Anchored a lot because when I, for example, use my texture here, and I want to place it on some location, but I want to fix the size, or rather, I want to control the size. Then I can just go to Anchored mode. I can hold down the left mouse button and then drag up with the mouse. That way it's like a stamping tool where I can rotate it, and then when I let go, I have it applied. Cool, right? Then we have the last one. I will go into details because curve, I don't use curve a lot. So we'll use the line. This means we can actually just create a line. So for example, I make a line here by just holding the left mouse button down and go to the position, and it will create a stroke. And here, and here, and here. So that's what line is. Okay, now comes also a very important option, and that's called curve. To demonstrate it better, I will go back to Anchored mode, and I will click on the curve button. Right now you will see we have my auto easing in here, a sinus curve. That means everything which is outside of the border here, or in our brush settings, the outside border will be blurred. So I can change here different things. So for example, if I want to have a hard edge on the brush, I can just go down to this one here. And then when I use Anchored, you have hard edges. Then we have different kinds of things, how they're being applied. So you have a lot of choice how to use your fall off, your brush fall off. Okay, let's set it back. Then we have external. I don't know what it does, so I will not go into detail with it. Then we have symmetry. Very, very important, because when you have two sides of a symmetrical object and you want to paint them simultaneously, you can enable the x-axis, the y-axis, or the z-axis. Mostly it's your mesh is on the x-axis. You can see it by following this red line here. On this line, for example, it would be the y-axis. So your mesh needs to be aligned to the corresponding axis. So right now my mirroring is happening on the x-axis, so I'm using the x-axis here. So just click on the x-axis, and now when I paint here, I will use a different color to demonstrate it. You will see it that it's being mirrored on both sides. Very useful. And if you don't want to use it anymore, you just click on X and it is only being applied on one side. So the rest, I will not go into it But that's the texturing tools. And now comes one very, very important thing. Always save. Click on image and click on save image. Every time you paint on it or have painted on it and you are basically satisfied, you should save your image, because then it's first being applied to the texture. I would save often because sometimes Blender crashes. Especially when you go from texture painting to rendering, and then from rendering back to texturing, and you try to undo a stroke. So always take a little bit of time when you're, for example, in the rendering mode, go into the texture painting mode and wait maybe 1 or 2 seconds. I think these crashes have something to do with the rendering engine, that the PC actually tries to perform the cycles renderer, and when you go too quickly back, it will not be able to basically complete the rendering process, or rather the cancelling of the rendering process, basically overburdening the software with instructions. So let it take a little bit of time. We are not in a rush. So that's what all of these options are. I hope I wasn't too fast and not clear enough. And in the next one, in the part 3, we will finally get nice and dirty with texture painting. So we will basically texture a character mesh. Okay, I see you in part 3. Bye bye.